Evening, welcome to week 3, Intel 450. I hope everyone's having a good class here. I enjoyed everyone's discussions from last week, and look forward to more of the same. So what we're going to cover is terrorism evolution for this class, and you had the four waves reading as well as the Hoffman, so that should give you a pretty good introduction. Before I get to that though, I just want to give a heads up that the exam is next week. I'm going to push out the exam at the end of this week. You'll have next week to do it, and it'll be due at the end of next week. Pretty straightforward. If you've done the readings, you listen to the lecture, you'll do fine on it. It's not something very difficult. But the one thing I ask is that you have a very clear thesis in your writing, and that you back it up with argument. So thesis, argument, conclusion. Do not give me a summary of the discussion boards. Do not give me a summary of the readings. What I want is your opinion validated by your analysis. And that's the only way you're going to get a good grade on that. So, today's topic, terrorist evolution. I'm going to talk before jihadism. So, the rest of the course is going to be dedicated to Al-Qaeda and jihadi terrorism. This course and these readings were dedicated or meant to cover the period before Al-Qaeda. And in history, we have certain goals that terrorist organizations have hoped to achieve. Some have been political goals, other have been anarchy, desire to promote anti-government societies. Some have been anti-colonial. And the last, what we've seen in the last few years, is religious-based terrorism. And that's kind of the motivations of each terrorist organizations throughout history. And for the readings, they kind of group them into the four waves of modern terrorism. And that report does a pretty good job of packaging it. The first wave he covers is the anarchist phase between the late 1800s to about the 1920s. And these were groups who engaged in terrorist activity because they wanted to disrupt the status quo. There's a lot of rich people. It was the area of robber barons, and you had people just blowing up government facilities, blowing up buildings because they weren't unhappy with the gross income inequities that were shown back during that time frame. And this was prevalent in Russia, in Britain, and even in the United States, where you had a pretty wide-scale terrorist activity. And again, there wasn't huge weapons, but they used things like dynamite and small other explosives to get their point across. And not huge numbers of casualties, but enough to bring publicity to their cause. So that was the first wave. It kind of petered out in the 1920s. In the second wave was 1940 to 1970s. This is considered the anti-colonial wave, although you could say it might still be happening now. And these were terrorist organizations that focused against the countries that were occupying them. So we'll get to the case studies in the future, but it's the Irgun in Israel engaged in terrorism against their British occupiers. The FLN in Algeria engaged in terrorism against their French occupiers. The Vietnamese, Viet Minh in Indochina, again against the French. The Mau Mau in Kenya against the British authorities there. And again, after World War II, there was this huge sweep of much of the world was occupied or colonized by major powers. And after World War II, there was a sweep to prevent for native people to take control, and that manifested themselves in these terrorist acts that I'll cover in a second. So this was carried again from the 1940s to about the 1970s, and by the 1970s, 1980s, much of the world had been decolonized. No great empires really existed, so that kind of forced the next wave to peter out. The third wave, this started in 1967, and it's covered in the Hoffman book pretty well, is the Palestinian Marxist phase. And for those you see in One Day in September, this is a pretty you'll see it illustrated pretty well in One Day in September. And these were the big catalyst for this wave was the victory of Israel during the Six-Day War and the occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula. This forced Palestinians to again turn towards terrorism to bring attentions towards their cause. The biggest example, there's a bunch of hijackings, but the biggest example is obviously the 72 Olympics in Munich, otherwise called as the Munich Massacre. And then that you could probably say, it deteriorated. Deteriorated after the Cold War. So in the 1990s, that kind of petered out. But what rose in its place was religious-based terrorism, and this is Al Qaeda, Hamas, Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Those are the biggest factors that we've seen. And again, we've seen that from the 1990s pretty much to current day. So those are kind of in a nutshell the four waves of modern terrorism. But what I want to go from there are two case studies that are brought up in the reading. And the first, as I mentioned, was the Irgun in Israel. And this is considered the start of modern terrorism, or terrorism to achieve a very defined political objective. Just a little background, the Irgun was a Jewish organization before World War II that tried to establish an Israeli homeland in what is now Israel, what back then was British-occupied Palestine. It started before World War II, but after the Holocaust, after the killing of 6 million Jews, that accelerated their desires and accelerated the operations tempo of the group. So the Irgun suddenly after the Holocaust realized that it was nice to have a Jewish state, but after the Holocaust it was absolutely critical to get a Jewish state, and they would stop at very little expense, would stop at no expense to achieve that. Again, and their political objective was very simple at the start, was to kick the British out. The British were occupying Palestine. The Israelis, the Irgun, saw that as an impediment to building a sovereign Israeli state, and they wanted to kick them out. Their primary focus for their terrorist activity were not on civilians, but on the British occupation apparatus. The military, the British authorities, those were the major targets for the Irgun. And what they saw was they desired to increase the occupation, the cost of the occupation to the British. The British were involved in World War II, it cost many lives, lots of treasure, and the Israelis knew that, the Irgun knew that, and they wanted to make sure that the British actually had to pay a severe penalty for occupying their territory. So that was their primary target, but the one thing that they really did well was they used media to advance their cause. That they knew that, and this is the time TV roles were beginning to fill out, newspapers were starting to go widespread, and they knew that their audience was not in Israel. Their audience was in Britain, where they knew that the British people were growing weary of occupying foreign countries. And then their other audience was the United States and the UN, which was beginning to assemble in New York and wanted to recognize, or Israel wanted to be recognized by the UN. So that was their objective. And so they conducted numerous attacks. End result is that they forced the British to leave their territory. Their attacks were successful. They achieved an objective, and this was, for example, that terrorism worked. It worked to achieve an objective. British were kicked out, and the Israelis were able to take over and form their own homeland. Now there was other attacks against Arabs. There's other attacks against Arab civilians, but the primary target for the Irgun was the British occupation authorities, and it was 1947, the British, or 49, the British packed up and left. So that's the first case study. Second case study is the FLN in Algeria. And it's difficult to underestimate the value that the FLN has had on future terrorist organizations. Nelson Mandela, he's quoted the FLN as examples of how to conduct an operation. Yasser Arafat, he saw the FLN as a model. It is a model on how to use violence to achieve a political objective. If the Irgun focused on attacking colonial apparatus, the FLN, they were the first to have brutal attacks against civilians and actually use that to advance their cause. So the FLN, just a little background, again, after World War II, France was part of Algeria, and it was not just a colony of Algeria was not just a colony of France, but it was almost like what Hawaii is to the United States. Algeria was to France, almost a 50th state. There was millions of French citizens who lived in Algeria. Algerians spoke French pretty consistently. It wasn't seen as another colony. And after World War II, the FLN, when they started their uprising, they focused against the French authorities. They focused against the French military, the French political apparatus that was occupying Algeria, just like the Irgun did. However, the FLN was not successful in this. Their operations were pretty haphazard. They didn't achieve any widespread objectives. But starting in 1956, they changed their tactics. And this is, I think, a great irony. They started to focus on killing civilians, on widespread massacres of not just French civilians, but even Algerians that were seen as sympathetic to the French. Just as a side note, the Iraqi and Afghan Taliban insurgents have used the same tactic to actually similar effect. And this was actually more effective. This brought attention to their cause more than anything else. This forced the French to retaliate or to focus on a large-scale counterinsurgency. Now, it's important to note, and this is not widespread thought, but the French were actually very successful against their counterinsurgency. They pretty much destroyed the FLN. They dismantled many of the cells. They destroyed it in the cities. They destroyed it in the rural areas. But their tactics that they used were so brutal that they included torture, rounding up civilians, searching women, that it pretty much alienated not only the French in the eyes of the world, but the French population from participating in Algeria, and they became revulsed. So by the 1960s, even though the FLN really was destroyed in Algeria, they had won the PR game. And they had only just won the PR game against the French citizens, and that eventually forced de Gaulle to become head of France, and eventual withdrawal from Algeria. So these are kind of the two case studies. The one thing to take away from this is that terrorism works. It worked. In both of these cases, it worked. And they served as models for future terrorist organizations. You're going to watch One Day in September if you haven't seen it already. You're going to see that terrorism worked in that case. The attack against the Munich Games brought so much publicity to the Palestinian cause that it allowed them to achieve their objective. So that's the bottom line you should get from this history, that terrorism, sometimes brutality, sometimes killing civilians, it's sometimes